That was false. It was a delusion.
This is in fucking sanity.
Don't do any harm. Back the hell off.
I was somehow a man, despite being a biological female.
And their lives are ruined. Their bodies ruined. Even the fucking New York Times wrote a major story about detransitioners. So people that were convinced at an early age that they were trans and now they're detransitioning and their lives are ruined. Their bodies ruined. They can't have children anymore. They lost their breasts. They lost their penis.
At the age of 12, I started experiencing some gender dysphoria, and I started seeing a therapist, and I got the diagnosis, and I started going on the path of medical transition at the age of 13, starting with blockers and then moving on to hormones. And at 15, I got a double mastectomy, but it turned out that it wasn't the best decision for me, and I stopped transitioning at the age of 16.
It's in fucking sanity. They just just had an 8-year-old kid that was taken away from his father because the father doesn't want the boy to be on hormone blockers, and the mother does.
Now, obviously, they didn't really do an evaluation of my mental health. It was just like, oh, so you're transitioning. You identify as a boy, and you've been on hormones for such and such amount of time. So I was eligible. And after my first appointment, the surgeon told me about a top surgery classroom that was taking place in the hospital building and encouraged me and my parents to attend it. And I went, and I learned basically the same things that I learned in the surgeon's office. About like the different types of incisions and how it benefits gender dysphoria. Basically, just propaganda. There are maybe about like 12 to 15 or so other families in there. I noticed right away that all the other kids in there looked to be either younger than me or like they hadn't even started on hormones yet. And I was shocked that they were already seeking surgery.
30% of kids today recognize themselves either as trans, gay, bi, or non-binary. 30%. Now look at this. The pediatric gender clinics in 2007, there was 2. One was in Virginia, and one, it looks like it was in Massachusetts, and now look at them. They're all over the country. And this is in 2022. I mean, that's crazy. The idea that this is just, they're recognizing there's a problem that existed all the time but wasn't being treated, that's nuts. That doesn't make sense, especially when you're talking about children.
They're fucking kids.
Yeah, they're kids.
Kids.
Jordan Peterson was warning people about in 2016 when I first met him. And everybody was like, why do you care about what's happening in colleges? This is just fringe things that are happening in colleges. I'm like, those people are going to graduate and they're going to enter into the workforce, and it's a new mentality that exists. It's not a objective reality mentality. It's an ideologically based mentality that's going to change the world at large unless we stop it in its tracks. Like, they're not looking at reality.
There is no evidence whatsoever that transition of the medical sort actually has a salutary effect on mental health, partly because the long-term studies simply haven't been done. And the idea that we actually know from a research perspective that a child is much safer if they start transition than they are if they don't. Again, that's simply not true. Ken Zucker's work has showed quite clearly that if you just leave the kids alone, then by the time they're 18 or 19, most of them settle into their biological identities.
The fucking detransitioner thing, the fact that it's in the New York Times is big. But do you know why? I mean, there's a whole story that somebody wrote about it. It's because of trial lawyers. Everyone's going to get sued. And it's going to be a big fucking problem because you've thousands of people that have unfortunately given into this. Kids are extremely malleable. They're extremely easy to manipulate. They're extremely easy to influence. We've always known this. It's one of the reasons why you don't let children get tattoos. It's one of the reasons why you don't let children join the military. It's one of the reasons why you don't let children have children. It's one of the reasons why we have ages of consent, because we know that they're not young enough, they're not smart enough, they're not old enough to make their own decisions. They can be manipulated. So if they can be manipulated that way.
The problem with me starting it so young was not only that I couldn't consent, I couldn't really fathom the full picture of things. I'm still experiencing a wide range of complications to this day. from the surgery, I'll never be able to breastfeed. I'll never have that erogenous sensation in my chest back. I'll never have my breast back. A reconstruction will do nothing for me, and it might make things worse actually, because I've had some complications pop up this year with the grafts. I have to cover them up with bandages, or else I don't know what's going on with them. I tried to consult my surgeon about it, and he didn't really investigate. He gave me advice that made the complications worse even, and actually temporarily gave me an infection. But I have to bandage up every day so that it doesn't leak all over my clothing or bedding. And
Jesus.
From the hormones and blockers, I've been experiencing some joint pains, mainly in my arms, my legs, and my back. And
Yep.
I still have issues with my urinary tract. I have to use the restroom pretty frequently, and I didn't even know that this was possible. This is a pretty huge quality of life issue that I'm experiencing, and I'm just not really getting any help for it. And on top of that, I do hate to speak about it, but I'm experiencing sexual dysfunction at the age of 18. That's something that women usually go through when they're in their 40s to 50s.
Why the fuck would we think they can't be manipulated by this emerging market, which is gender care, this gender-affirming care? Have you ever seen the map of gender care from 2007 versus 2022? It's fucking bananas. It's a business. My friend, who is a doctor, told me that his friend, who is a plastic surgeon, who moved into gender transition care, he told me the difference between what that person gets paid for an arthroscopic surgery versus what they get paid for gender transition. I forget what the number was for arthroscopic surgery, but for the gender transition, he gets $70,000 every time he does this. And he goes, and this guy is raking it in. He's doing them all week.
My dad asked about the regret rate. I don't think they even used the word detransition. They said there's less than a 1% to 2% regret rate. They also told my parents that if I wasn't allowed to go through with this, then I would be at risk of suicide.
Your parents, like many parents in this situation, were put in a very, very difficult position. And I would say it's corrupt to the point of malevolence, what the medical professionals are doing on this front. And that is the insistence, well, would you rather have a live trans child or a dead child? Which is, I don't think there's anything more toxic you can say to a parent than that, because that backs them into a corner. Because their alternatives are then, well, you can let your child go ahead with this absolutely life-altering hormonal and then surgical treatment, or your child can die, and it's your fault because you don't care enough. And parents, they're accustomed to trusting their medical professionals, at least to some degree, and accustomed to assuming that the knowledge they put forward is valid and reliable. And the information that your family was given was none of those. In fact, it's pathological to a degree that's almost imaginable. It's criminal, in my estimation, what you were told. Because there is simply no evidence that any of that is the case. There's no evidence that transitioning kids are less likely to be suicidal. There's no evidence that that's the only treatment path that works. And there's certainly no evidence that there's no alternative to transition or suicide. It's so pathological, I can't believe it. But it's no wonder your parents were pushed into a corner, because that's a dreadful choice for a parent to have to make.
It's important to note that, it absolutely was negligence, because not only was I given surgery for a problem that was psychological in nature, in the months before that, that was when I had been diagnosed with depression and social anxiety, and when my suicidal ideation started happening. At the beginning, they told my parents, your child will be at risk of suicide if you don't affirm her identity. But it wasn't until after I started the treatments that I started feeling like committing suicide.
Gender dysphoria. It's a psychological disorder. It's always been listed as a psychological disorder. And now in 2024, everyone who is a man who thinks he's a woman is brave and amazing. No one's sick. So you're allowing people that are absolutely perverts and sex offenders to go into women's locker rooms with a heart on, and no one can say anything. And if you say something, they will protest your business and shut you down. There's no room for any nuance. There's no room for someone to say, hey, listen, for some people, there's clearly this thing in them that makes them feel like they're in the wrong body. And if we are compassionate and if we are kind, we would want that person to be able to express themselves in any way they want that makes them feel better, that helps everybody. But also, there's perverts. But also, there's people that if they find out all they have to do is pretend they're a woman and they can go in the women's locker room and watch women change.
There are good long-term studies of children with gender dysphoria. Most of them were conducted in Toronto, where I happen to be, by a man named Ken Zucker. And Zucker ran a clinic for gender dysphoric kids way before this became part of the culture war, let's say. And he was a very straight and honest scientist, a very good researcher, not a political person. And what he showed was, what his clinic showed, many peer-reviewed studies, was that gender dysphoria of the type that you described is relatively rare. But if you leave kids alone till they're 19 or 18, 80 to 90% of them settle into their biological identity. Although about 80% of them are also homosexual in their orientation. And so the pathway for him, before this was all politicized, was you'd have a child who was gender nonconforming temperamentally, and then prone to depression and anxiety, and then that combination would produce this gender dysphoria, and that would become quite intense around the dawn of puberty. But if you just backed the hell off and waited, those kids would settle into their body, but generally adopt a homosexual orientation. And so that was, as far as I could tell, that was the best research. Now, Zucker got slaughtered for this once it became politicized. He lost his job. He was pilloried by the Toronto Star, the newspaper here. He won a lawsuit against them just a couple of years ago, but they demolished his career. And his guideline medically was, don't do any harm, right? Back the hell off. You can provide these kids with support and you can walk them through their emotional problems, but you should certainly not rush into anything more dramatic.
There's a lot to that, actually. I mean, I was basically living a lie for a few years. That was very stressful, and I was trying to uphold this idea I had myself in my head that was false. It was a delusion. I genuinely believed that I was somehow a man, despite being a biological female. And in a lot of ways, I missed out on on certain developments, mostly social. I'm still, I didn't really go through the crucial social female socialization
Right.
that goes on throughout late middle school or in high school. My dating pool was also affected by this. I was mostly attracted to men. I didn't really have much of an interest in women, but most of the people who were interested in me in high school were women. And the few guys who admitted attraction to me, it seemed very sexual in nature, and it felt like, if anything, I was just like a fetish to them almost. And I didn't want to have anything to do with that.